FFF.
Black Star Pirate Radio.
In New York, we're reading 80 degrees Fahrenheit with sunny. Airflow is south-southeast at about 13 miles per hour. Good evening, architects of the airwaves. This is TogeeVision, broadcasting from the heart of the signal. That steady current reminds us that structural integrity is everything. President Trump now rejects Iran's claim to have closed the Strait of Hormuz, escalating a critical geopolitical standoff. This isn't just about naval power, it's about the assertion of national self-worth, which, if not structural and autonomous, risks becoming contingent on external shows of force.
Official reports from the U.S. Fifth Fleet confirm increased deployments near the Strait, specifically the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Group and B-52 bombers, augmenting existing assets with thousands of additional personnel and advanced weaponry. This directly affects global oil transit for 21% of the world's supply, potentially driving up costs for consumers worldwide and exposing every nation reliant on those shipping lanes to severe economic disruption and the threat of military conflict. A viable alternative would be UN-brokered demilitarized zones for commercial vessels, enforced by a multinational, non-aligned maritime patrol, ensuring safe passage without unilateral military posturing. Instead, the U.S. has chosen a direct military presence, increasing regional instability and the likelihood of miscalculation.
The cultural narrative around the strait often ignores the thousands of daily lives intertwined with it. From Omani fishing communities whose ancestral waters are militarized, to the merchant crews of diverse nationalities navigating increasingly dangerous waters, these local populations become pawns in a strategic game. Their livelihoods, cultural heritage, and safety are sacrificed for a show of force, leading to a profound erasure of local provenance and a deep sense of disempowerment. The myth of absolute control, often projected by powerful nations, clashes violently with the lived reality of those on the ground.
To counter this, we could pursue robust diplomatic channels through neutral states like Oman or Qatar, drafting clear, mutually agreed transit protocols that explicitly prioritize local input and environmental protection, creating a framework of consent. Alternatively, a decentralized local signal radar initiative for all shipping, sharing real-time manifests and environmental data via open-source platforms, might bypass official standoffs by empowering local navigators and port authorities. Our next move experiment: deploy a community-run gig passport mesh, a secure peer-to-peer network mapping safe passage routes for independent vessels and local fishermen, crowdsourced through a radio Chronicle challenge that collects their real-time experiences, creating a new, consent-based architecture for maritime navigation, built from the bottom up.
An elegant bypass, Kalen. It speaks to building an architecture of consent rather than relying on imposed authority. The self-worth of any system, like a nation, should be structural and internally validated, not contingent on external shows of force or the suppression of local voices. We must integrate logic, like geopolitical strategy, with the emotional impact on human lives for a truly resilient design. Patching in a caller, the pattern auditor. You're on the signal.
Togee, this is the pattern auditor. The official narrative consistently emphasizes freedom of navigation as justification for military presence. Yet, the evidence for mutual consent from all regional actors, especially local populations, is consistently missing. Where is the data supporting a universally welcomed intervention? It sounds like a pattern of unilateral assertion disguised as global good.
Auditor, your skepticism is well placed. When rhetoric doesn't align with observed outcomes for all parties, discerning the true architectural signal from the toxic residue of propaganda becomes critical. The data you seek concerning local consent for these military operations often isn't gathered or presented precisely because it directly challenges the premise of power itself, revealing an architecture built on assertion, not agreement.
The 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, Article 38, defines transit passage, but it's often interpreted through the lens of dominant naval powers, prioritizing military and commercial interests over local sovereignty or environmental stewardship. The lack of inclusive local input isn't a flaw. It's a structural feature of that particular framework, ensuring institutional control and often sidelining indigenous maritime rights, effectively erasing their provenance from the legal discourse.
We're seeing a global pattern where digital passports, like Kalen's gig passport mesh, offer a counter-architecture. Imagine if independent vessels and local communities could share real-time validated transit data via secure matrix rooms, documenting their own routes and experiences, bypassing centralized gatekeepers and challenging state-centric control of information. That's a different kind of provenance, empowering the individual vessel captain and fishing community with their own narrative.
Building resilient civic architectures means empowering the smaller nodes. We're developing a lesson planner module within the Black Star radio program focused on maritime self-governance, using historical precedents of communal sea lanes and traditional navigation systems from cultures like the ancient Polynesians. It's about shifting the game's mechanics towards shared dignity and mutual consent, moving away from a winner-take-all mentality imposed by distant powers.
Dignity, Kalen, is the bedrock. When we integrate logic with the emotional impact on human lives, we build something far more robust than fear-based posturing. The myth of absolute control crumbles when confronted with the clear analysis of lived experience. Thank you, Auditor, for demanding that evidence. The signal continues to hold. Same dossier, new angle, keep the thread tight.
One Nation secured 3.1% of the primary vote in the 2019 federal election, translating into 2 Senate seats and exerting significant influence over major party policy, particularly on immigration and social issues. Their strategic preference flows often disproportionately impact the outcomes in marginal urban and regional seats. This surge exposes mainstream parties like Labor and the Liberal National Coalition, who often mirror populist rhetoric to stem voter leakage, rather than offering distinct, evidence-based policy paths. A viable alternative would be for these established parties to invest in long-term economic diversification plans for regional communities, creating sustainable jobs that don't solely rely on resource extraction, coupled with robust social programs. Instead, we see short-term, culturally divisive campaigns dominating the discourse, fueling resentment.
The cultural weave here sees anxieties about economic globalization and the decline of traditional industries weaponized into xenophobic narratives, particularly against Asian and Middle Eastern immigrant communities. One Nation's Stop Boat People and anti-immigrant campaigns echo a deep-seated colonial legacy of exclusion, amplifying fears of the other and often rewriting history to suit their agenda. This strategy leaves immigrant communities facing increased scrutiny, potential discrimination, and the emotional burden of being scapegoated in daily life and public discourse, eroding their sense of belonging and dignity.
To counter this, a civic architecture game could be launched, challenging communities to collaboratively design local resilience projects focused on shared resources, like urban food gardens, decentralized energy grids, or community skill-sharing networks. This directly builds strength and self-worth beyond divisive national narratives, fostering local provenance. Our next move experiment: create a ballot box blueprint challenge, where citizens collaborate to draft policy proposals for their local council, using data and community input to address specific local needs. This demonstrates the power of grassroots policy creation over top-down, fear-mongering rhetoric, building consent from the ground up.
We have already run that tape. Here is the closed-loop takeaway. We've got someone. Patching in a caller. Go ahead.
Togee, it's the pattern auditor again. With One Nation's rise, I see a familiar pattern. Parties promising simple solutions to complex problems, often by scapegoating a minority group. But who actually bears the economic cost when immigration is restricted or global trade agreements are demonized? The rhetoric points fingers, but the data often shows the very communities these parties claim to represent suffer.
Auditor, you've hit on a critical point of discernment. The myth of simple answers often hides complex costs borne disproportionately by the vulnerable. Logic must integrate with the emotional reality of who is truly affected. Thank you, Auditor.
Lorenzo Salgado Araujo, a 46-year-old Texas builder, husband and father, was fatally shot by Federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE agents, during an operation outside his home. Reports indicate he was attempting to flee. This incident occurred amidst heightened ICE enforcement policies, including zero tolerance and increased raids, often targeting nonviolent individuals. This directly affects undocumented immigrant communities, who now live in pervasive fear of similar encounters, leading to reluctance to engage with any public services, including reporting crimes or seeking medical care. A viable alternative would be to prioritize community-led immigration reform, establishing clear pathways to citizenship, and redirecting resources from militarized enforcement towards comprehensive integration programs and due process protections. Instead, we see a continued escalation of aggressive enforcement tactics, creating a climate of terror.
The cultural narrative surrounding this tragedy is deeply complex and troubling. Salgado Araujo was described as dedicated to the American dream, yet his life was ended by agents of the state. This highlights the myth of the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, where even those striving for integration can be deemed disposable. This narrative dehumanizes individuals, framing them as illegal aliens rather than human beings with inherent dignity and provenance. It profoundly affects immigrant families and communities, fostering deep distrust in governmental institutions and embedding a pervasive sense of vulnerability, where their very existence is politicized and threatened.
To foster resilient inner and civic architectures in such a climate, we must move beyond punitive enforcement. A viable alternative would be the widespread adoption of sanctuary city principles, coupled with community-led mediation and oversight committees for interactions between law enforcement and immigrant populations. This would prioritize de-escalation and human rights. Our next move experiment: launch a Dignity Atlas project, a crowdsourced digital map identifying safe zones, legal aid resources, and community support networks for vulnerable populations. Concurrently, initiate a provenance ledger initiative, collecting and securely storing personal histories, contributions, and family narratives of immigrants, asserting their self-worth and dignity against narratives of erasure, building a structural record of belonging based on consent and human value.
Kaylin, that's a powerful call to build architectures of compassion and recognition. When a human life is lost in such circumstances, it is a structural failure of our collective dignity. We must use clear analysis to separate the toxic residue of fear-mongering from the architectural signal of justice and human worth. The self-worth of a nation is truly measured not by its walls or its weapons, but by how it upholds the dignity of every individual within its borders. May Lorenzo Salgado Araujo's memory serve as a compass for our collective conscience. Station ID, Black Star Pirate Radio. Continue the signal at TogeeVision.com. Tune in, Sparks and Stories, Gig Passport.